Well, it is so good to be with you this afternoon. So glad that you have joined us. Whether you've joined us in person or online, we are glad that you are here. And we continue our study of Paul's letter to the church at Rome. And as you know by now, the overarching theme of this letter is that God's gospel unveils God's righteousness to all people. And we've worked our way through the first major section of the letter, which deals with the challenge for God's righteousness. And the challenge is human unrighteousness. And Paul certainly hones in particular on the unfaithfulness of Israel to be the covenant people, to be the light of the world. And in the midst of all that, Paul makes a grand announcement that God's righteousness continued. And it was revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, and in particular in his obedience unto death. And the gospel events of Jesus' death and resurrection reveal God's righteousness in these ways. That God has been true to the covenant, that God has properly dealt with sin, that God has come to the rescue of those who are helpless, to the unrighteous, to the unfaithful, and that he's done so with impartiality. He's done it for Jew and Gentile alike. And then Paul returns to the topic of a previous topic that he had presented before making the grand announcement to demonstrate how God's righteousness rules out the boast of that the Jewish people maintained. That they were in a position better than the Gentiles. But Paul begins to unpack that some and talks about how because there is one God, there is one people of God, and because there is one God and one people of God, they must be marked out by something other than the law or the Torah. If that's not the case, if the Torah still is the central piece, then it would continue to be a barrier between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, as I mentioned before, can you imagine being in a church where there's a wall between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians? And one side they have the law, the other side they are not under the law. What Paul argues is it is faith that marks out a true believer, one that has been justified by God. And so Paul in chapter 4 begins to give more detail to what he means by that. He provides a rather persuasive argument to show what the covenant was really all about in the first place. And so we began chapter 4 last week by looking at the first 8 verses, and they provide really a foundation for the point that Paul is trying to make. And the point is this: that Gentiles are welcome in the covenant family on the basis of faith and faith alone. The key point that he continues to hammer in chapter 4 is a passage of Scripture taken from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, which is part of the covenant that Abraham and God are under. And it's in Genesis 15:6 that we read, "Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned or credited to him as righteousness." So righteousness is based on faith, not on what we do, but on faith. That's the point that Paul's trying to make. So that brings us to our text for today, which is verses 9 through 17 of Romans chapter 4. And remember, in verses 7 and 8, that Paul has just given an illustration from the Old Testament, from the book of Psalms, which is thought to be Psalm 32, but thought to be a Psalm of David where he talks about blessedness. So that's where we pick up in verse 9. "Is this blessedness only for the circumcised, or also for the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. It was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who live by law are heirs, faith has no value, and the promise is worthless, because law brings wrath. And where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our Father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. It's a lot there. So before we dive in, allow me to offer a prayer. Gracious and loving God, we come before you today thankful of the gift that you have given us, the gift of right relationship with you and the world through your Son, Jesus Christ. And as we gather to better understand this passage and therefore better understand our faith, we pray that we might be aware of your Spirit that is here with us, helping us to understand and also apply this teaching to our lives today. May what we do during this time together be pleasing to you and bear much fruit for your kingdom. It's in your Son's name that I pray. Amen. So let me read verses 9 through 12 again, just so that it's fresh in our minds, so that as we begin to unpack it. So, is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So I think one way to understand the question that he asks at the beginning of verse 9 is to recognize that it is a sharper form of the question that he asks in verse 1. In verse 1, he asks the question, what then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, discovered about this matter? Here he's taking that question and making it more specific. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? In other words, does all that has been said about Abraham and about David in verses 2 through 6 only apply to Jews? Does it not also apply to Gentiles? In other words, should Gentiles be required to become Jewish, to become proselytes into the Jewish faith, to be circumcised if they're male, if they are to inherit the promises made to Abraham? So Paul has been talking previously in chapters 2 and 3 about this new family that is created because of what Christ has done. A family that is made up of circumcised and uncircumcised is what Paul has said in verses 2 through 6, contradicting what he's already been talking about. And he says, of course, no. And that is what he goes on to show here in the latter part of verse 9 through the beginning of verse 11. And he begins this section again by making reference to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned or credited to him as righteousness. And he does this to show something. And that something is this. It is not until Genesis chapter 17 that Abraham is circumcised. So Paul's argument is that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness while he was what? Uncircumcised. Okay? So Abraham experienced this blessedness without circumcision. All right? So that's a pretty persuasive argument. But Paul does not want to diminish circumcision altogether. He doesn't want to be accused of saying that circumcision is a bad thing. So he gives it a place of honor. He talks about circumcision being a sign, okay? A seal that demonstrates that you have faith, okay? It's not circumcision that makes you righteous. It's faith that makes you righteous, but that is demonstrated through this seal or this sign of circumcision, okay? So what is interesting is if you go to the letter that Paul writes to the church at Galatia, and in chapter 3, Paul argues there that the covenant of circumcision that Abraham went through and extended to his ethnic family, the Jews, was really designed by God as a temporary signpost on the way to the bigger reality. And that bigger reality is the coming of the Messiah and the universal availability of this faith to all nations because of God's grace. So in Galatians 3, Paul argues that circumcision is a sign of things to come, okay? A temporary signpost, not a lasting requirement. And I think that helps us understand the point that Paul is trying to make here in Romans chapter 4. By designing circumcision as a sign or a seal of Abraham's status, who was righteous because of his faith, Paul still reclaims it, even though he says it's not as important as you think. Because faith is what is the true indication of someone being a part of the covenant family. And circumcision points to that reality. So what he's arguing is this. If it is circumcision that makes you a part of the covenant family, then you've got it all wrong. Okay? It's not that. It's faith that makes you a part of the covenant family. If you see circumcision as what makes you a part of the covenant family, you're seeing it in the wrong way, Paul says. Now, for Paul, when he uses the word righteousness, he is meaning being a part of the covenant, being a member of the covenant family. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 11, where it talks about Abraham's circumcision, God says that this circumcision is a sign of the covenant. And in Romans chapter 4, beginning of verse 11, Paul says circumcision is a sign or seal of righteousness. And so in Paul's mind, covenant and righteousness are equal, okay? This is not an explanation as much as it is, or not an alteration, but an explanation of what is going on in Genesis chapter 17. So Paul goes on in the latter part of verse 11 and into verse 12 to stress the point that he's trying to make. And the stress is not so much on the method or the timing of Abraham's justification, but on what comes from it. What follows from it is that uncircumcised believers are every bit as justified as Abraham was. These verses almost seem to imply that uncircumcised believers are more obvious children of Abraham than those who are circumcised believers, okay? Because they're like Abraham in that he was uncircumcised when he was justified by his faith. So Paul is emphasizing to the circumcised and the uncircumcised that what matters is faith. Not an act, but faith. All right. So it's almost as if Paul is reversing something that he said in chapter 1, verse 16, when he talks about to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. Here we almost see the reverse of that. It's almost like to the Gentile first and then to the Gentile, or to the Jew. So, in essence, remember, the question is Abraham our fleshly father? Okay? And what Paul is saying, Abraham is not our physical father, our father because he was circumcised. What he's saying is, he is your father for those who place their faith, because that's what he did. He placed faith in God, trust in God. And so he's trying to get the Jewish audience to understand that Abraham is their father not based on circumcision, but based on their faith or trust in God. All right, so he's diminishing circumcision to some respect, but he's elevating the essence of faith. And so you might say his point is that circumcision is beside the point as it relates to membership within the covenant family. And I think it's interesting to think about what is the sign or seal of our faith in Jesus Christ. So when a person places their faith in Jesus Christ, we ask that they demonstrate that faith, not through circumcision, but through baptism, right? Right, yes, yeah. So it can be used in bad ways, for sure. So there is a connection, perhaps, between circumcision and baptism. Both are a sign of faith or trust in God. In fact, I think it's interesting to note in Paul's letter to the church at Colossae, in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, this is what Paul writes. Listen to these words. In him, in Christ, you were also circumcised in the putting off of the sinful nature, the flesh, not with a circumcision done by the hands of men, but with the circumcision done by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism and raised with him through your faith in the power of God who raised him from the dead. So I think, it's interesting to think about how circumcision for the Jews, as Paul understands it, is a sign of their faith. Baptism for Christians is a sign of their faith, symbolizing the commitment that they've made. So to summarize Paul's argument to this point, does the family of faith have to regard Abraham as their physical father on the basis of circumcision? And Paul says no. Abraham was justified freely by grace without works, as was David, and this faith is precisely faith in God who justifies those who are ungodly. Okay? Abraham was justified while he was uncircumcised, and he establishes a pattern for all people, especially those who were uncircumcised. Paul is using Abraham not primarily as an example, but as the basis for his argument about who God is and who God's people are. But he does so within the context of covenant faithfulness. So that brings us to verses 13 through 15, which, if the previous verses is about justification is not by circumcision, these are more focused on justification is not by the law or the Torah. Verses 13 through 15. It was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who live by law are heirs, faith has no value, and the promise is worthless, because law brings wrath. And where there is no law, there is no transgression. So these verses are not explaining a new topic. Instead, they are helping to explain what has come before. In the NIV translation that I use, there is no for at the beginning of verse 13, but in the original Greek, there is the Greek word for, gar. It's there. And so that tells us that what he's talking about in these verses is explaining what he just talked about in the previous verses. So Paul is now reaching the point to demonstrate what he has said in verse 21 of chapter 3. In verse 21 of chapter 3, he says, "But now a righteousness from God apart from the law has been made known." And so what he's saying by talking about this here is that the law, the Torah, cannot be the boundary marker for membership or the badge for membership in the covenant family that God has created. So Paul reintroduces the law here as a further explanation of why circumcision is neither necessary nor sufficient for membership in the family of faith. To treat the law as necessary would make it a badge for membership. But Paul has already said that the law condemns those who possess it. And he says it again here, the law brings wrath. And so if the divine promise is to be fulfilled, it must be fulfilled apart from the law. And that's what he's talking about in these verses. In verse 13, Paul reminds us of the promise that was made to Abraham in Genesis 15. Remember in Genesis 15, God promises some land, right? The land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. But Paul expands upon that. And he says that the promise that he would be heir of the world, not just the land of Canaan, but heir of the world, all right? Not just one territory, but the entire world. And so the thought that Paul is expressing here is that God is God of the entire world. He's not God of just a little territory or an area in the world. He's God of the entire world. And it is through Jesus Christ that brings all the nations together under God. Okay? So that's what he's meaning when he uses that expression. So the point of this verse 13, is that the inheritance, the promise that was repeated in Genesis was not given to Abraham's seed based on the law. Okay? And he goes on further to explain that in verse 14. And you notice in our NIV translations that the for is there in verse 14. It is explaining what he's just said in verse 13. If those from the law, Jews, are heirs, That means Gentiles would be excluded until they became Jews. But when Paul says that, what he's saying is, in actuality, no one would inherit the promises because the Jews have already demonstrated an inability to be faithful to the law. So that makes the promises null and void. So if you follow the law, then that makes faith useless, and it nullifies the promise. Right? Okay, so it has to be based on something else. Why does and Paul further explains in verse 15, because law brings wrath. Law works wrath. What he means by this is what he had already mentioned in chapter 3, that what the purpose of the Torah, the law, is to point out sin. Okay? And what does sin do? It invokes the wrath of God. So if the inheritance is confirmed based on the law, then guess what? Nobody inherits the promise, because all it does is show you your sin. So those who are inside the law are subject to the wrath of God, and those who are outside the law are just outside of God. All right? And that's where they would remain, without something else in place. So it can't be based on the law. But then he adds this phrase, where there is no law, there is no transgression. It's an interesting phrase. What does that mean? Well, we know what it doesn't mean. We know that because of what we've already read in chapter 1, where Paul describes the sinfulness of humanity and how that is demonstrated even in our world today. This does not mean that Gentiles, because they're outside the law, are without guilt. There's still sin, but what Paul is saying is they're not aware that they are breaking the law of God because they are not under the law. Okay? So where there's no law, there's no transgression. Okay? They are not being explicitly disobedient to the commands of God. So the point is that Abraham, guess what? He didn't possess the law either, right? He didn't have, the 10 Commandments. He didn't have the Torah. Abraham was not, in the technical sense, a transgressor. And since he wasn't a transgressor because he didn't have the law, the Gentiles are not transgressors either because they don't have the law. He's just trying to build another argument that Gentiles and Abraham have more connections than the Jews want to give him credit for. And so this brings us to the climax of the chapter thus far. Let me read that again. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. He's the father of us all. As it's written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our Father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. So what Paul here is making an argument is that Jewish and Gentile believers are one family according to the promise made by God. Now in verse 16, we can understand verse 16 as the answer, the explicit answer to the question that he raises in verse 1. Okay? What does Abraham say about this? What does his experience demonstrate? It demonstrates that the promise comes by faith. Okay? Now what's interesting about this is in our English translations we don't see this. But verse 16 in the Greek does not have verbs, subjects, or objects. That would drive an English teacher crazy, okay? It literally reads this way. Therefore, by faith, so that by grace, so that the promise might be valid for all the offspring or seed, not only for the one from the law, but also for the one from the faith of Abraham. Therefore, by faith, so that by grace, so that the promise might be valid. That's what it says. There's no subject-verb agreement there. It's a very confusing phrase. But what Paul is saying is this. All is by faith, so that all may be according to grace. Okay? All is by faith, so that all may be according to grace. So what he's saying is the promise of God is universally available to all. It is the gift of grace. But it becomes your gift when you believe it, when you believe God, when you trust God. The whole seed, all of Abraham's offspring, notice that it includes Gentiles and Jews alike. It is a multi-ethnic family. It consists of not the one from the Torah only, but also from the faith of Abraham. Now, taken by itself, we might see this implying that Jews who kept the law formed one part of the family, and Gentiles who showed Abraham's faith form another part of the family. But we know that possibility is ruled out based on everything that Paul has said previously. Therefore, when Paul says the one from the law or from the Torah, he's using that phrase to say the Jew, and so he's saying here not only to Jews, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. Okay, the argument that Paul is making here is that whether you are of the law or not of the law, you are one family by faith. Okay. In verse 17a, Paul backs this up. This that Abraham is the father of us all by quoting Genesis 17:5. I have made you the father of many nations. Okay. God didn't say to Abraham, I have made you the father of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Israelites. God says, I've made you the father of many nations. Okay. Paul picks up that verse and puts it here and says, look, God promised that Abraham would be the father of many nations, very diverse. And so he then backs that up in the latter part of verse 17 with a great statement about a theme that's present in this chapter. And that is the character of God in whom Abraham placed his faith. Now, one thing I want you to notice is this takes us back to verse 2. Verse 2 says, if in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God, right? So now you come to verse 17, and it says, Abraham, he is our father in the sight of God. Okay, so this is like the answer to the verse 2, that Abraham has something to boast about because of what God has done. Not because of what he did, but because of what God has done. It's just a beautiful connection there. So there's an interesting way that Paul describes God here. He says, the God who gives life to the dead and the God who calls things that are not as though they were. And he is again using imagery from the book of Genesis. The God who gives life to the dead is about a God of resurrection, right? That is something even the pagan gods did not claim to do. They could not bring life out of death, okay? And God is also described as one who brings into existence things that are not, okay? So that's an image of God who is a creator, okay? So that's, we see that certainly in the book of Genesis. God as creator, God as life giver. And so this God who is the creator and the life giver is the one who is faithful to keep his promise to us. And his righteousness is what justifies us who place their faith in him. So what does this description mean here? Okay? When God brings a Jew to share the faith of Abraham, this is like life out of death. Okay? They are under the law. They are under sin. Their law is pointing out the sin to them. And what happens to persons under sin? They are condemned by God. They're under God's wrath. They are cut off from God. But when a Jewish person places their faith in the God who justifies the ungodly through what has happened through Christ, it is like the dead coming back to life, right? They are a part of the covenant family, all right? And when God brings a Gentile to faith, this is creation out of nothing because the person did not have any previous covenant relationship, right? They weren't under the law, okay? So God is creating something out of nothing, all right? So it's an interesting image that Paul is using here. So faith and grace and promise are vital subjects of this chapter, but the main subject is Abraham and his family and the character of God. And this is what we should expect, because what Paul is talking about here overall is the revelation of God's covenant faithfulness and the creation of a new family, Jew plus Gentile community. So Paul's way of telling the story of Abraham grows directly out of what he now believes God has done through Jesus. Okay? So verses 16 and 17 sum up neatly the argument that Paul has made in the chapter so far. So where Paul goes from here is he starts to analyze the faith of Abraham as he begins to draw all these threads together. Okay? So, what are we to say about this as it applies to us today? Well, it's a reminder to us that Abraham is our father, okay? He's not our father because we've been circumcised or because we follow the Old Testament law. He is our father because he has the same faith that we do. Simple trust in God and his promises. So the descendants of Abraham are not the members of any particular nation, but those of every nation who belong to the family of God. And so this is a good reminder to us that the way to God is not through membership of any nation. It's not through any ordinance like baptism. The only way to God is by faith, which takes God at his word and which makes everything dependent not upon our achievement or on our record, but solely upon the grace of God. That's why God's grace is so amazing. It's not given to us because we deserve it. It's given to us in spite of ourselves. That's what makes it so amazing. And so we might look at Paul's mind in this way. One side is the promise of God based on faith and grace. And on the other side is the promise of God based on the law but it leads to transgression and wrath. So which side would you rather embrace? Faith and grace, or wrath and transgression? That's the choice that we have. And so I think it's a great reminder for us of the gracious gift of God to us through Jesus Christ. All right? So that's where we'll end our live stream. Those who are here in person, does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Do you see where Paul